Hey, everybody. I am here with Andy Jones, who is the endowed chair. Andy, help me again with the names.
The William A. and Nancy R. Klamm Chair and Curator of Ornithology here at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History.
Awesome. And Andy, we're going to talk a little bit about one of the cards in the Rust Belt Arcana Tarot, which in this case was the common Nighthawk, which is a very cool species. And I wanted to ask folks who are doing these interviews kind of why they picked the different cards. So, Andy, why do you associate or think about the Nighthawks? What's your connection there?
The Carolina Wren singing in the background was on your end was not available, so I went with another favorite bird of mine. Common Nighthawks are they're ones that are pretty familiar and common in urban areas, but if you don't know to look for them, you miss them. And I love that they're really long distance migrants too. So they've got kind of this aspect of wilderness and also this aspect of familiarity too, which is great.
That's really cool. So when you look at those common nighthawks, you're actually where you're at right now. You're in the specimen storage area at the museum, correct?
Yeah, I'm on the lower level at the Natural History Museum.
Yeah. So, and I've been down there with you and seen the birds. It's amazing. Could you tell us kind of what's uh, the purpose of the collections? I mean, we talked about this before, but I think it's a really interesting thing for people to hear how these are used.
Yes, we have about 35,000 specimens here, and just in the bird collection. If you look across the whole museum, it's a couple million. But so we have this collection that's a bunch of specimens that are behind the scenes. They're not usually visible to the public. They're here for research use. So sometimes they're for really straightforward things like identifying that this bird was at this place at this time. Is it we're making a list of the species that occur in Ohio? We would start with a specimen basis. But you could also do things like plucking a feather, taking it to a chemistry lab and finding out what kind of contaminants in the wild are also making it into the birds. And even things like where do they feed in the ecosystem? Like where are they in the food chain? That's reflected in their feathers as well. And then what I'm not showing you here is we also have a freezer associated with this collection. So we have frozen material for DNA work and lots of other associated things too.
That's very cool. So the card, the association with this card, the reason that this card got picked for this is rest, and so it's a picture of this bird kind of sitting on the ground, and we talked briefly. They're huge migrant, long distance migrants.
Yeah.
What does rest mean for one of these things? What does that look like? What's home look like for a bird that travels those kinds of distances?
Yeah, I mean, the times I see them are when they're in full migration. So they're like in August, I'll see groups of dozens flying over my house as they're going south. I might see a few in the spring. So there's that's not rest at all. But during the day, they're roosting either on trees or on the ground. And in migration, you'll catch them in trees. A lot of times, especially when they're nesting, they're just right on the ground. Their breeding behavior is that they lay 2 eggs on nothing. They don't build a nest at all. They just find a good spot that looks good on the ground. And so if you're out wandering kind of fields that have bare dirt available, you might flush one from the ground. And so you'd think these birds are just sitting all the time. Their group that they're in, the family group they're in, are called the goat suckers. And that's a bizarre name, but what it comes from is goat herders would go out in the morning to get milk from goats. And if the goats weren't milking that day, they would blame the bird that was also being flushed from the field when they walked out there, which would be something like a nighthawk or probably a whippoorwill relative in Europe or the Middle East. That's probably where that origin is. And then that name's had a life of its own. In Spanish, it's chupacabra, which is a legendary crypto thing I think in Mexico. But yes, there's all kinds of cool stuff associated with those because they're sitting out in open spots on the ground.
That's amazing. You've got some specimens there, and you were kind of pointing to a claw. You want to tell me what we're looking at there?
Sure. So this is one of 3 trays of common nighthawk specimens we have here at this museum. Most of them are from spring and fall migration. They tend to, they get hit by cars because they're resting on the ground sometimes, or they'll get turned into rehab centers when they're ill. If they don't make it through rehab, they come here. So we've got this tray of specimens, and what they look like is the specimen has been, basically everything was taken out of it, cotton was put inside, and it was sewn up, and that's it. So if you want to come revisit this bird in a couple hundred years, it'll still be here. That's once we've taken out everything that can go bad and rot. These specimens last a long time. We have specimens that date back to the early 1800s in our collection here that are still in great shape. And so common nighthawks are really interesting. I mean, you can see this, the wing is so long, it sticks beyond the tail. And it's a really odd shaped bird. It's got a huge head. It's got big eyes. You can see the cotton sticking out. And I don't know if you'll be able to see up close. It looks like they have no bill at all. Like it's just a micro bill, but the corner of its mouth is here. So they're eating moths at night and other flying insects. And it looks like they couldn't cram it in that mouth, but it's really just a tiny beak and a huge mouth for grabbing food. So if you have a tiny beak, well, they use the beak for feeding, but they also use it for preening. So they're cleaning their feathers. That is not a very good beak for preening. And so nighthawks and a few other birds too. I don't know if you'll be able to see this here. Let me put my finger behind it. There on the edge of this claw, the edge of the claw itself has a comb on it. So when this bird is scratching itself, not only does it use a claw, but it's got little comb-like structures coming off the edge, so they can actually grab things like mites and lice that are living in its feathers. Let me try getting that up against the camera one more time. It might be too close to see. Maybe I'll send you a picture or something like that. But yeah, they're strange birds with some great adaptations.
I love the looks of that thing. It's so super cool. So when they're migrating, where are they migrating kind of to or from? Are they migrating north of us in kind of Ohio, Cleveland area, and then going south to the Amazon or Caribbean or something? What are they doing?
Yeah, so I live in Cleveland Heights here in Northeast Ohio. I've had them in the nesting season at my house, but they're nesting all across North America and down into parts of Central America. And they're also well north of us. You can get not to the Arctic Circle, but you can go way north into Canada and still find nesting groups of common nighthawks. And in the winter, they're in South America. So they have a colossal migration. Actually, their wintering range is not well understood. We have specimens in museums from the wintering range, but not many. And if you go birding there are other species of nighthawks that look really, really similar, and they're not breeding, so they're not calling. So it's really hard to identify something that looks like that, that's like a quarter mile over your head. So we know they're in South America. People are doing some geologger and nano tagging work to actually track their migration, but we don't have all the answers for these yet. They have a really bizarre, exaggerated flight. So we actually preserve the wings separately. So there's a spread wing from a nighthawk, and that is a really narrow, long wing. And to go along with that long, thin wing, they also have this really erratic flight, kind of like a bat, but slower.
It's such a weird bird. I mean, what draws you to this thing?
I like things that are cryptic. I like that they're usually, my experiences with them are unexpected. So the first time I heard one in my yard, I was in the house watching TV, but I had the window open because it's nice outside, and heard one calling. I have seen them while out fishing in late May when it was really cold weather, and a flock showed up right at dusk. But because it was really cold, all the insects were down by the surface of the lake. So I got to look at eye level at nighthawks feeding right over the surface of the lake. I've run into them on the wintering grounds in huge flocks. And then I've seen them in really remote areas. I was once doing field work in northeastern Oregon, where it's mostly like sage flats and sage desert. And they were out there displaying. and the days were really long. So they would start while it was still broad daylight. And I didn't even mention they've got this crazy call. So they have this like loud peent kind of call that they give. And as if that wasn't weird enough, when they're displaying, they go up high and they do a fast drop towards the ground, and then they pull up. And something about the way they pull up runs air through their wings in a way that it makes a roar. And you don't see many birds doing that sort of thing. So this bird is, everything strange about that. And you get this great display. I've only gotten to see it a few times because they're less common birds in the East now. But I was camping in the middle of Oregon and got to watch these, all evening long. And that leaves a great memory.
I would love to see that roaring. I've heard it's like a boom almost too. Like it's like a percussive sound sometimes.
Yeah. And it just like it swells because it's not like a sound that's on and off. It kind of begins out of nowhere and gets loud. And yeah, that's awesome. They used to do this over a lot of parking lots, because these used to be much more urban birds, because they'll nest on the roof of buildings. But if they're going to do that, it needs to be a roof that has lots of rocks so they can just drop their eggs on and have them be camouflaged. Well, nowadays, a lot of our roofs are just plastic or rubber or other like solid materials, and crows pick those off immediately. So they don't nest on those kinds of roofs. And we think that's part of the reason they've declined in the East. But they used to be much more common urban birds. And if you have older infrastructure, like where I am in Cleveland Heights, there's some older buildings that still have the right kind of roof. And, they're still displaying over open areas around here, which is fantastic. A lot of people do like standardized surveys to check on the status of birds. So year after year, people do the Christmas bird count. They might do the breeding bird survey. Those are midwinter counts or summer mornings. You're not going to get nighthawks on those counts. And so you have to do a specialized focus count for things like marsh birds and for night birds. And there's not many people doing that. So the data is not really that good. All of the at least anecdotal and sort of inconsistent data seems to point towards a pretty heavy decline, like perhaps as much as 50% over the last 50 years. Because of the nesting issues, but also they're aerial insectivores. They fly and they eat on the wing. And just like the swallows you mentioned, all of those, the birds in that sort of feeding guild are really getting hammered. We're putting a lot of pesticides out there that wipe out moths and other flying insects. And all of the animals that depend on that are in a, I wouldn't say free fall, but they are declining more precipitously on average than other types of birds.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Andy, I want to end on a happier note than that. I got to think of something.
Me too.
I say we got to think of something better to end on other than decline, because that always makes me sad.
Well, we got the fact that we're talking here in March, and these birds are just now leaving or getting ready to leave their wintering grounds, and they've got an epic migration ahead. I'm pretty sure they go around the Gulf of Mexico, like through the overland. And they will be winging their way back here pretty soon. So no matter where you live in North America, you're going to be encountering common nighthawks by like mid-May is when we really get good numbers going. And I just think that's a powerful thing to see these birds they're still carrying out these thousands of miles of migration. They're still using all kinds of things we'd consider kind of scrubby habitats and urban areas. And I don't know. I think that's a thing to give us hope.
Absolutely.